What are the biggest differences between carpentry and masonry? The word carpenter means maker of a carriage, and the word mason simply means maker or wall maker. But these terms actually have a very similar etymological root as one another, because in our ancient past, cultures across the world would mostly build in either wood or stone as their primary building material. So if you lived in ancient Lebanon and told someone that you were a builder, they would assume that you work with stone or brick. And if you lived in ancient Norway and you told people that you were a builder, they would assume that you work with wood. A great example of how similar these terms are is the ancient Greek word tekton, which back in the day was used interchangeably to refer to either a worker of stone or wood. Over time, however, especially in the medieval period, the trades became very defined and specialized. They had workers' guilds where craftsmen could study, experiment, and perfect their chosen craft in the construction of castles, churches, bridges, boats, and elaborate houses. And today we have the terms mason and carpenter, which refer to either a stoneworker or a woodworker. But what I find interesting is how few people notice the drastic ways in which carpentry has evolved over time when compared to masonry. The primary tool of a mason 4,000 years ago was a trowel. The primary tool of a carpenter 4,000 years ago was an axe. Today, a mason still uses primarily a trowel, whereas a carpenter today primarily uses a drill, nail gun, and a circular saw. Ancient people knew about hand saws, but they were very difficult to create and even harder to keep sharp, and so cultures that did lots of work with wood found ways to just use a simple axe to cut down trees, debark them, and shape the lumber to create houses, boats, and furniture. A mason doesn't need very many tools to do his work, and almost all of the tools are non-electric. Sure, you can buy a cement mixer and an angle grinder, but wheelbarrows and chisels are still sufficient for the vast majority of mason jobs. Unless you're building a skyscraper, you can get by using all non-electric tools. A mason's tools are more or less the same as we wind the clocks back 4,000 years. But carpentry today, if you want to be good at it and actually make money doing it yourself, requires a very long list of expensive tools that all need their own cords, batteries, hoses, lubricants, blades, sandpaper, and of course, warranties. Building a simple fence can be easy with just a circular saw and a nail gun, but unless you're only building fences, you may also someday have to buy a table saw, chop saw, palm sander, jigsaw, router, sawzall, multi-tool, and many other expensive tools. Not to mention a workshop big enough to store all of these. Now, what about America's houses? In America, we might look around and think that most of our houses are made of wood, but that's not exactly true, is it? The siding is usually cement board or plastic these days, and even if it was wood, the 10 layers of paint covering it make it look like plastic anyway. The roof is made of asphalt shingles, metal, or tiles, and when you go inside, most of what you see is just painted sheetrock. You don't get to see or feel a whole lot of actual wood. It's mostly hidden behind cheap synthetic siding and plasterboard. Masonry, on the other hand, is right out there in the open for everyone to see. And if you have an artistic eye like the ancient Romans and Renaissance French, masonry structures can be very beautiful and they last way longer than anything built out of wood. Wood burns. Masonry does not burn, and there are even fireproof concrete mixes like the ones that I've used in building pizza ovens. Wood rots. Masonry does not rot. Algae and bacteria might grow on its surfaces, but that can easily be scrubbed off. Wood is not soundproof unless we're talking about log homes. You have to soundproof nearly all wooden buildings with other materials, whereas masonry all by itself is very soundproof. Over time, wood splits, warps, bends, and twists. Concrete doesn't do those things, and it does crack, but filling those cracks is fast, easy, and cheap compared to removing structural pieces of wood and then putting new pieces back in their place. Not to mention, according to hundreds of studies easily found online, masonry is far cheaper to build with than wood these days. So if masonry is cheaper and longer lasting than wood, what pros are there to building with wood that beat out masonry? Personally, I can only think of one. It's a little bit faster to build with wood than masonry. The reason I say a little bit faster is that the price of masonry materials really doesn't budge that much over time. During the COVID lockdowns, a 2x4 went up almost $14 more where I am. The materials that I use to do masonry work pretty much stayed the same. I think cement went up like $1. So it might be faster to build with wood once you have it in your possession, But if it takes you longer to work and save enough money to buy all of those materials, it might be faster if you just get started laying one brick at a time. Carpentry work depends on trees to grow and to be turned into lumber, and it takes a lot of time for trees to grow. Sand, clay, and rocks, which are the primary building materials in masonry work, they don't need to grow or be processed, and they're just sitting around all over the world, regardless of the rain or the sun. Even though cement does have to be made in a furnace, not all masonry work involves the use of cement. Many walls and footpaths and even buildings can just be made using blocks, gravel, and sand. So hopefully this video is starting to help you understand why I prefer being a mason more than a carpenter. The world is always going to need both trades, but I think it's finally time for a big light to be shown upon the beauty of masonry work. I've had a lot of experience doing carpentry jobs, and I always noticed that I didn't really need knee pads, and I never lost any weight doing that sort of work. It's still blue collar, but I would argue that it's a lighter blue. Masonry work, on the other hand, is quintessentially blue collar. It is dirty, it's monotonous, and it's not for the faint-hearted. Masonry, I always say, is like going to the gym but getting paid for it. Digging footings, mixing mortar, stacking blocks, and shoveling sand is all very hard on the body. But I think that if you use good form, you can do it well into your 70s, as a lot of traditional European villagers have shown us. So all of that being said, I'm not trying to diss on carpentry work at all. I have mad respect for builders who can work all by themselves and frame an entire house. It's incredible. I used to work for an amazing framer. It's not easy work either, and there's a lot to know about framing. Another thing I might add is that framing, or just carpentry work in general, it involves a lot of math. Masonry work doesn't really involve that much math. And the reason for that is because in carpentry, you're cutting down to a certain size, whereas with masonry, you're building up to that size. So you still need numbers, not nearly as many or as often. And since I'm kind of dumb, I prefer that. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. My name is Levi. Please share this on your social media and leave a comment letting me know what construction topics you think I should cover next.